Imagine this. Your child comes home in tears, bullied by someone bigger, meaner, and protected by a corrupt system. But what that bully doesn't know is that the boy's father isn't just any man. He's a former Delta Force commander. And when that father is pushed too far, he unleashes a side of himself no one expected. Tonight's story isn't just about survival. It's about justice, family, and the unshakable strength of a protector. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because this is one story you won't forget. Imagine a quiet black farmer, a man who only wanted peace for his family. But one arrogant cop saw him as a target, treating him and his loved ones like criminals. What the officer didn't know was that this farmer wasn't just a farmer. He was a former Delta Force commander, trained in ways that would change everything. What happened next shook the entire town. Before we begin, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. The morning sun stretched across the wide fields, painting the soil golden. On the edge of town, miles away from the busy highways, stood Samuel Carter's farm. A quiet man in his mid-40s, Samuel had traded years of secrecy and shadows for the simple life of planting corn, raising chickens, and watching his 2 children grow. His wife, Angela, often said, "This farm is our little kingdom." She meant it. The land wasn't just soil and wood. It was peace, stability, and family. Samuel carried himself differently from the other farmers in the county. He was disciplined in everything, waking before dawn, sharpening tools with precision, and moving with an ease that suggested control, even in silence. The neighbors noticed. Some admired him, others whispered behind his back. To most, Samuel was just a hard-working black farmer trying to provide. But to one man, Officer Richard Doyle, a white cop with a history of targeting minorities, Samuel was a problem waiting to happen. Doyle had never liked the sight of Samuel's farm thriving. He couldn't stand the idea of a black family owning such fertile land, especially when some of his own relatives had failed to keep theirs. Every time Doyle drove past in his patrol car, he slowed, glaring at the Carter farm like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. But Samuel never looked twice at him. He just tipped his hat, walked back to his barn, and kept working. What no one knew, not even his wife, was that Samuel Carter was no ordinary man. Buried beneath years of quiet living was a secret that made him one of the most dangerous men in America. He had once been a Delta Force commander, trained for missions so classified they were never spoken of again. But for now, Samuel was just a farmer. At least, that's what the world thought. Officer Richard Doyle had a way of throwing his weight around in town. People didn't just see him as a cop, they saw him as a bully with a badge. He picked traffic stops carefully, pulled over cars he knew couldn't fight back, and left warnings that were more threats than law. For weeks, he had been circling Samuel Carter's farm, looking for a reason to interfere. And finally, one hot afternoon, Doyle pulled his squad car right into the Carter driveway. Dust rolled up behind him like smoke. Angela came out first, drying her hands on a dish towel. Their son, Marcus, just 12 years old, peeked out from behind her, curiosity in his eyes. "Something I can help you with, officer?" Angela asked politely. Doyle leaned against his car, smirking. "Depends. Heard some things about your husband. Thought I'd come see for myself." Samuel stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. He carried himself calmly, not a hint of fear in his eyes. "What kind of things?" "That maybe you've been selling more than crops," Doyle said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Funny how a man like you manages to keep a place like this running. Some folks think maybe you've got other income streams." Angela stiffened, but Samuel remained composed. He looked Doyle square in the eye. "We work hard, officer. That's how. Doyle laughed. Work hard. Or hide things. You see, Carter, men like me, we don't like secrets. And you? You look like a man full of them. So here's a warning. Stay in line. Because I'll be watching. And if I find so much as a broken fence out of place, I'll make sure you and this little farm of yours get what's coming. The words lingered in the summer heat like poison. Samuel didn't flinch, didn't argue. He simply stepped closer, close enough that Doyle could see the steel in his eyes. His voice was low, controlled, but carried a weight that made Doyle instinctively shift his stance. You're free to drive through my land, officer. But remember this, some fences aren't meant to be tested. For the first time in years, Doyle felt a flicker of unease. Something about Samuel's tone, his stance, the calmness of his gaze. It wasn't the look of a farmer. It was the look of a man who had seen real battles. But Doyle, too arrogant to admit it, spat on the dirt and climbed back into his car. As the patrol car rolled away, Angela looked at her husband with worry. Samuel, why does he hate us so much? Samuel didn't answer. He just stared at the dust trail fading into the distance, his jaw tight. Somewhere deep inside, the part of him he had buried long ago, the soldier, the commander, stirred. The days that followed were anything but peaceful. At first, it was small things. A broken fence line near the road. A warning notice pinned to their mailbox, unsigned but obviously from Doyle. Then, one evening, Angela found their chickens scattered, the coop door mysteriously left wide open. Samuel fixed the damage quietly. He didn't complain, didn't storm down to the sheriff's office. His life had taught him that sometimes silence spoke louder than anger. But his children noticed. "Daddy," Marcus whispered one night as Samuel tucked him in, "why does that cop hate us? Did we do something bad?" Samuel sat on the edge of the bed, his calloused hand resting gently on his son's shoulder. "No, son. Some men hate without reason. Some men look at what you have, and it burns them inside. That's not our fault. That's theirs. But hatred doesn't rest. It grows." A week later, Doyle pulled the Carter family truck over on the way to town. Samuel had been driving with Angela and their daughter Naomi, who was only 9. "License and registration," Doyle barked, hand already resting on his holster. Samuel handed the papers over calmly. "Everything should be in order." Doyle glanced at them, then tossed the documents onto the ground. "Step out of the vehicle." Angela gasped. Naomi began to cry. "On what grounds?" Samuel asked evenly. "Because I said so," Doyle sneered. "Or are you resisting, farmer boy?" Samuel looked at his daughter trembling in the back seat. Every muscle in his body told him to act, to strike, to put Doyle in the dirt where he belonged. But he took a slow breath, opened the door, and stepped out. Doyle frisked him aggressively, slamming his hands against the hood of the truck. Then, finding nothing, he leaned close and hissed into Samuel's ear. "You don't belong here. Men like you never do. I'll find a way to tear all this down. Your farm. Your family. Watch me." Naomi's sobs echoed through the night air. That evening, after Doyle finally drove away, Angela said the word Samuel had been avoiding for weeks. "Samuel, he's not going to stop. He wants to break us. And I'm afraid, one day, he'll go too far." Samuel looked out over the fields, the corn swaying under the moonlight, the soil he had poured his life into. His voice was steady, but his eyes were sharp. "If he brings war to my door, Angela, he'll find out too late whose door he opened." It was a Saturday morning when the line was finally crossed. Samuel was out in the fields, working the tractor, when he noticed Doyle's squad car parked near the edge of his property. At first, he thought it was just another intimidation trick. But then he realized Doyle wasn't alone. Marcus and Naomi had been playing near the fence, chasing each other with sticks, when Doyle called them over. "Hey, kids," Doyle said with a false smile, his hand resting on his belt. "Your daddy ever tell you what happens to folks who don't follow the rules?" Marcus froze, remembering his father's warnings to never engage. But Naomi, too young to understand, frowned. "Daddy follows the rules," she said firmly. Doyle's smile vanished. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so Samuel couldn't hear from the distance. "You tell your daddy that the next time I come around, if he doesn't start respecting me, something bad might happen. Maybe a fire. Maybe an accident. Farms can be dangerous places, especially for little kids." Marcus grabbed his sister's hand and pulled her away, just as Samuel leapt down from the tractor and strode toward them. His steps were fast, controlled, and his eyes were colder than the morning air. "Step away from my children," Samuel ordered, his voice like steel. Doyle raised his hands mockingly. "Relax, farmer. We were just talking." Samuel positioned himself between his children and the officer, his broad frame shielding them completely. Angela had come running from the porch, fear and fury in her eyes. "Stay off my land," Samuel said, his tone low, final. Doyle smirked, but there was a flicker of unease again. "Careful how you talk to me, Carter. You keep this up, and I'll come back with backup." "You bring whoever you want," Samuel replied, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "But hear me well, Doyle. You ever speak to my children again, and there won't be a badge in this world that can protect you." For a moment, silence hung heavy. Doyle met Samuel's gaze, and for the first time, he felt something he couldn't quite place. Fear. He spat on the dirt again, muttered something under his breath, and climbed back into his cruiser. Tires kicked up gravel as he sped off. Angela rushed to the kids, holding them close. "Samuel, this can't go on. He's dangerous." Samuel put an arm around his family, his eyes still locked on the fading dust trail. Inside, the soldier within him stirred restlessly. He had buried that part of himself for years. But Doyle was digging it up, inch by inch. And soon, Samuel knew, the time for silence would be over. 4 weeks, Doyle had been stewing. His pride was bruised, his authority challenged. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw Samuel Carter's calm stare haunting him. He couldn't stand it. And like all bullies, he needed to prove something, to himself, to the town, to anyone who dared doubt him. So one stormy night, Doyle made his move. It started with the sound of engines. Samuel had just finished securing the barn when he heard multiple vehicles crunching across the gravel road. Lights swept across the farmhouse, blinding in the dark. Then came the voices, harsh, commanding. "Sheriff's Department. Step outside." Angela froze at the kitchen window, clutching Naomi's shoulders. Marcus peeked through the blinds, his young face pale with fear. Samuel stood in the doorway, watching as Doyle and 3 other officers spread across his yard, rifles in hand. "What's the charge?" Samuel called out, his voice steady. Doyle grinned under the brim of his hat. "Illegal possession. Heard you're hiding weapons, Carter. Thought we'd come take a look." Angela's voice cracked from inside the house. "That's a lie." Doyle smirked. "Then you won't mind us searching, will you?" Samuel stepped down from the porch, rain spattering across his shoulders. "You've got no warrant." Doyle's smirk widened. "Out here, my word is the law." The other officers shifted uneasily. Some of them knew Doyle's vendetta was personal, but none had the courage to stand against him. Samuel looked back at his wife and children. He had tried silence. He had tried patience. But now, with rifles pointed at his home, he felt the soldier inside of him rise, fully awake, fully alive. "Angela," he said softly, without turning his head. "Take the kids to the cellar. Lock the door. No matter what you hear, you don't come out until I call for you." Her lips trembled. She knew what those words meant. But she obeyed, ushering Marcus and Naomi down the stairs, her heart pounding. Samuel stepped forward, into the pouring rain, his frame illuminated by the headlights. His voice cut through the storm like thunder. "You boys picked the wrong farm." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Doyle sneered and shouted, "Take him!" That was the moment Samuel Carter stopped being a farmer. And the Delta Force commander returned. The rain poured harder, drumming against the tin roof of the barn, splashing across the mud of the Carter yard. But Samuel's mind was clearer than it had been in years. His posture shifted, no longer the bent back of a farmer, but the controlled stance of a soldier who had led men into the darkest corners of the world. The first officer moved in, rifle raised. Samuel pivoted, catching the man's wrist and twisting hard. The rifle clattered into the mud as Samuel drove his shoulder into the officer's chest, sending him sprawling. "Drop him!" Doyle shouted. Another officer lunged, but Samuel was faster. Years of combat training flowed through him like second nature. He sidestepped, grabbed the man's collar, and swept his legs in one clean motion. The officer hit the ground with a thud, wind knocked out of him. The third hesitated, hands trembling on his weapon. Samuel's eyes locked onto him, calm, steady, commanding. "You don't want this fight," Samuel said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried authority. The kind of authority that came from experience. From survival. The young officer froze, lowering his gun slowly. That left Doyle. He raised his pistol, fury twisting his face. "You think you're some kind of hero, Carter? You're nothing but a dirt farmer." Samuel took a slow step forward, rain dripping from his broad shoulders, his eyes unblinking. "You have no idea who I am." Doyle fired. The crack of the gun echoed across the fields. But Samuel was already moving, dropping low, rolling through the mud, closing the distance. In an instant, he had Doyle disarmed, the pistol wrenched from his hand and pressed against his chest. The headlights caught Samuel's face, sharp, unyielding, dangerous. "I led men through deserts and jungles you can't even find on a map," Samuel growled. "I've buried brothers whose names will never be spoken outside classified walls. I walked away from it all to give my family peace. And you brought war to my home." Doyle's breath came fast. For the first time, the arrogance drained from his eyes. Samuel leaned close, his voice a whisper that cut like a blade. "You should pray I'm still a farmer. Because if I were still the commander I once was, you'd already be in the ground." Samuel shoved Doyle back, tossing the pistol into the mud. The other officers, wide-eyed and shaken, scrambled to their feet. No one dared move against him now. "Get off my land," Samuel ordered. No one argued. The young officer helped the others up, and they retreated quickly to their vehicles. Doyle staggered after them, his face pale, his pride shattered. The squad cars roared away into the storm, leaving Samuel standing alone in the rain, chest heaving, hands steady. When Angela finally emerged from the cellar with the children, she saw her husband in a way she never had before. Not just as a farmer, not just as a husband or father, but as something more. The protector. The warrior. The commander. By morning, word had already spread across town. Folks whispered in diners, gas stations, and church pews. Some said Samuel Carter had fought off a whole squad of cops with his bare hands. Others claimed he had hidden military training, though no one knew for sure. Doyle, humiliated, stormed into the sheriff's office. His uniform was still damp, his pride in tatters. He slammed his report onto the desk. "Carter assaulted law enforcement. I want a warrant for his arrest." The sheriff, an older man with gray whiskers and tired eyes, read the report carefully. Then he leaned back in his chair. "Funny thing, Doyle, none of the other men back up your story. They say you led an unauthorized raid. No warrant. No probable cause." Doyle's face twisted red. "They're lying. He's dangerous. That man isn't what he seems." The sheriff studied him. "Maybe not. But from where I sit, it looks like you crossed the line." Doyle left fuming, but inside, rage only grew. He couldn't stand being embarrassed. Not by a black farmer. Not in front of the whole county. He swore he'd get his revenge, one way or another. Meanwhile, back at the farm, Angela tried to hold the family together. She cooked breakfast, trying to bring normalcy, but the children sat quiet, glancing at their father. Marcus finally asked the question hanging in the air. "Dad, how did you do all that? You moved like a soldier." Samuel set down his coffee cup. His eyes softened as he looked at his son. "Because I was one. Long before you were born." Angela's hand trembled as she set down a plate. "Samuel, you never told me." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "I wanted to leave it behind. The missions, the battles, the ghosts. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would stay buried. But Doyle, he keeps digging." Angela's eyes filled with both fear and pride. "Maybe it's time you told the truth. Because if he comes again, the law won't protect us. But your past might." Samuel nodded slowly. He knew she was right. A time was coming when hiding would no longer be enough. And somewhere in town, Doyle was already plotting his next move. Doyle's revenge came quickly. By the end of the week, Samuel Carter's name was splashed across the local news. Doyle had pulled strings, leaked half-truths, and twisted facts to make Samuel look dangerous. The broadcast was blunt. "Local farmer linked to secretive military past. Is our town safe?" Angela stood frozen in the living room, staring at the TV. Naomi clutched her mother's leg, frightened by the flashing images of her father in uniform, old photos never meant to be public. Marcus sat silently, his young eyes wide with both awe and confusion. Samuel stood behind them, jaw clenched. He had expected this day to come eventually, but not like this. Not through the mouth of a corrupt cop. That night, the sheriff drove out to the Carter farm. He stepped onto the porch with his hat in hand. "Samuel, folks are rattled. Some are saying you're a threat. Others think Doyle's stirring up trouble again. I need to know the truth." Samuel nodded and invited him inside. For the first time, he told his story. Not the classified missions, not the names or details, but the truth of who he was. A Delta Force commander. A man who had spent decades protecting the nation in ways most civilians would never understand. A man who had retired to raise a family, to live in peace. The sheriff listened, silent and respectful. Finally, he sighed. "I've been around a long time, Carter. And I can tell when a man's dangerous. You're not dangerous. You're disciplined. And that scares Doyle, because he's never controlled anything but fear." Word spread quickly after that. Some townsfolk looked at Samuel differently, with suspicion, with caution. But others, especially those who knew the Carters personally, stood by them. The quiet farmer had become something more, a man of mystery, of strength, of survival. But Doyle wasn't finished. Humiliated twice now, He vowed to destroy Samuel completely. And this time, he wasn't coming with just a few officers. He was coming with everything he had. And Samuel knew it. That night, he sat at the edge of his children's beds as they slept, the moonlight spilling across their faces. He whispered softly, more to himself than to them. They wanted a farmer. But if they keep pushing, they're going to wake the commander. It happened on a moonless night, the kind of night where shadows swallowed everything. Samuel had been restless, walking the perimeter of his farm. He could feel it, the quiet before the storm. And then the storm came. Engines roared in the distance. Headlights flared across the fields. Not one, not two, but a whole convoy of vehicles. Doyle hadn't just come with a few men this time. He had called in favors, pulling every string he could. Squad cars, deputies, even off-duty friends with rifles. Nearly a dozen armed men stepped onto Samuel Carter's soil. Angela rushed to the porch, clutching Marcus and Naomi behind her. Fear gripped her chest, but when she looked at her husband, she saw no fear in his eyes. Only resolve. Doyle stepped forward, bullhorn in hand, his voice dripping with triumph. "Samuel Carter, you are under arrest for resisting law enforcement, assaulting officers, and harboring illegal weapons. Come out quietly, or we'll come in." Samuel's voice rang out across the dark field, steady and unbroken. "You've got no warrant, no case, only hate." Doyle laughed. "Don't matter. I'm ending this tonight." The men began to spread, rifles raised, flashlights cutting through the dark. But Samuel was ready. He had spent the last few days preparing. His land, his home, had become his fortress. With military precision, he used the terrain to his advantage. Floodlights snapped on, blinding the intruders. A flashbang, crafted from tools in the barn, burst near the gravel road, scattering Doyle's men in panic. Samuel moved like a shadow, disabling weapons, disarming men without firing a single bullet. Every motion was calculated, every strike efficient. Years of Delta Force training poured out of him as if the farm itself had transformed into a battlefield. Angela shielded the children inside, but even from the window, Marcus whispered in awe, "Dad's unstoppable." One by one, Doyle's men fell back, retreating, muttering that this wasn't what they signed up for. Within minutes, the so-called raid dissolved into chaos. Squad cars peeled away, engines screaming into the night. And then only Doyle remained. His face twisted with rage, he raised his pistol again, aiming directly at Samuel's chest. His voice cracked with desperation. "You think you've beaten me? You'll never belong here. You'll always be nothing." Samuel walked forward, unshaken, the barrel of the gun pointed at him. Step by step, until he was inches away. His eyes locked onto Doyle's, calm and unflinching. "I already belong. This land is mine. This family is mine. And you've already lost." Doyle's hand trembled. He pulled the trigger. Click. The chamber was empty. In his panic, he hadn't reloaded. Samuel took the gun from his hand effortlessly and tossed it aside. Then, with one swift move, he grabbed Doyle by the collar and slammed him to the mud. The flashing red and blue lights of a late-arriving sheriff's cruiser cut through the night. The sheriff stepped out, saw Doyle pinned in the dirt, and shook his head. "It's over, Doyle. You've gone too far." For the first time, Doyle realized it. He wasn't feared anymore. He was finished. The sheriff's voice cut through the night like a gavel. "Richard Doyle, you're under arrest." The words hit harder than Samuel's grip. Doyle lay in the mud, sputtering in disbelief. "You can't do this. I'm the law." But the sheriff only shook his head, cuffs glinting in the headlights. "No. You used the law like a weapon. And tonight, the weapon backfired. As Doyle was dragged to his feet and cuffed, the last of his pride drained from him. The men who once followed him now watched with disgust. None stepped forward to help. His reign of intimidation was over. Samuel stood silently, mud streaked across his arms, rain dripping from his jaw. His children rushed from the house, Angela close behind. Marcus and Naomi threw their arms around their father, holding on tightly, while Angela pressed her forehead against his chest. "You kept us safe," she whispered. Samuel looked out across the field, the same field he had worked day after day, season after season. It had seen storms, droughts, and now a battle. But it still stood. And so did his family. The sheriff approached quietly. "You know, Carter, there's gonna be talk. Folks will want answers. Some won't understand." Samuel nodded. "I don't need them to understand. I just need my family to be safe." The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then tipped his hat. "You've earned that peace, and I'll make sure no one disturbs it again." For the first time in weeks, Samuel felt the weight lift from his shoulders. He had not wanted to reveal the soldier inside him. But tonight proved something undeniable. He wasn't just a farmer. He was a protector. As dawn broke, light spilled across the Carter farm. Chickens clucked, the cornfield swayed in the breeze, and the storm was over. Marcus looked up at his father with wide eyes. "Dad, does this mean you're still a commander?" Samuel smiled faintly, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "No, son. It means I'll always be your father. That's the only title I need." Angela's smile returned, soft but strong. And together, the Carter family stood at the edge of their land, whole, unbroken, and free. Because no matter how far the past reached, peace had finally returned to their farm. At the end of the day, this wasn't just a battle between a bully and his victim. It was about truth overcoming lies, and love overpowering hate. Richard Doyle thought his power made him untouchable, but Samuel Carter showed the world that true power lies in protecting those you love. Remember, sometimes the strongest people aren't the loudest in the room. They're the ones who stand quietly until it matters most. If you felt this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more powerful stories every week. Until next time, stay strong, stay inspired, and remember, justice always finds its way.